Citre's knees hit the marble floor as the guards shoved her forward, her wrists bound, her lips split and bleeding. The Pharaoh's eyes bore into her, dark and unfeeling, as he lounged on his golden throne, his jeweled fingers drumming against the armrest. "You are to bear me a son," he said, his voice flat, his gaze cold as stone. Citre's chest heaved, her eyes darting around the grand hall, searching for Merek, the potter's son, the man she was promised to. But all she saw were the priests, their faces grim as they chanted blessings over her womb, their eyes dead, as if what they were doing wasn't a violation, but a holy act. "I'm already promised," Sitre said, her voice breaking, her wrists straining against the ropes. "Merek is waiting for me." The Pharaoh's jaw clenched, and he leaned forward, his eyes glittering like obsidian. "You are nothing," he said, grabbing her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You belong to me now. Your body will carry my heir. Merek will forget you, and so will you." Citre's heart pounded, her vision blurring as the high priest stepped forward, holding a golden staff. "She is blessed by the gods to conceive," he proclaimed, his voice booming through the hall. "She will carry the Pharaoh's seed." Merek's shout echoed from the crowd, raw and desperate. "No!" Citre's head snapped toward the sound, her heart twisting as she caught sight of him. His face streaked with sweat, his fists clenched, his eyes wild with fury and grief. But the guards dragged him back, shoving him to the ground as he screamed her name, his voice breaking, his body struggling against men twice his size. "Merek!" Sitre cried, her body jerking against the ropes, her chest heaving as the high priest raised the staff, his eyes rolling back in a trance. "Blessed be the womb that will bear the heir of Waset," the priest intoned, his hands hovering over Citre's belly, his voice a hollow, soulless echo. Citre's nails dug into her palms, her jaw clenched, her tears streaming down her cheeks as the Pharaoh's hand slid to her throat, his fingers tightening just enough to make her gasp. "You are mine," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "And by the time I'm finished with you, Merek won't even remember your name." Citre's vision swam, the world tilting as the chanting grew louder, drowning out Merek's screams, drowning out her own sobs. And in that moment, she knew. She wasn't just promised to the Pharaoh. She was trapped by him, and there was no way out. Sitre lay on the stone floor, the weight of the Pharaoh pressing down on her, his breath hot against her neck. His hands gripped her wrists, pinning her down, his eyes dark and empty as he moved against her, his teeth grazing her ear. "You will bear my heir," he whispered, his voice a low, cold rasp. "A son worthy of a god." Citre's nails dug into the stone, her jaw clenched, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The pain was sharp, searing, but the ache in her chest was worse, the ache of knowing that she was no longer herself, that her body was no longer hers. When he finally released her, the Pharaoh stood, adjusting his robe, his expression indifferent as he looked down at her like she was nothing more than a vessel. "Clean her up," he said to the maidens hovering by the door, their eyes averted, their faces blank. "And keep her locked in the concubine's quarters. Until she is with child, she does not leave." Sitre curled into herself, her arms wrapping around her middle as the maidens stepped forward, their hands gentle but lifeless as they pulled her to her feet. Her legs trembled, her skin slick with sweat and shame, her heart a hollow, echoing void. "This way," one of the maidens murmured, her eyes fixed on the ground as she led Sitre through the dim corridors. The walls were lined with torches, the air thick with incense, the whispers of other women echoing through the shadows. "You are the Pharaoh's now," the maiden said, her voice flat as they entered a small, windowless room. The bed was narrow, the walls bare, the only light a single, flickering candle. "Rest. You'll need your strength." Sitre sank onto the bed, her hands shaking as she pulled the thin blanket around herself, her mind spinning, her pulse pounding. Merek's face flashed before her eyes, his dark, desperate eyes, his fists slamming against the guards as they dragged him away. "Merek," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry." The door creaked open, and Citre's heart lurched, her breath catching as the maiden stepped inside, a bowl of water in her hands. "You're bleeding," the maiden said, her eyes softening as she knelt beside the bed, dipping a cloth into the water. "Let me clean you up." Sitre flinched as the cold cloth touched her skin, her fists clenched in the blanket, her body tense and trembling. "What's your name?" the maiden asked, her hands gentle as she wiped the blood from Citre's thighs. "Sitre," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I was promised to Merek, the potter's son." The maiden's hand stilled, her eyes darkening, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "I was promised once too," she said, her voice tight, her jaw clenched. "Before the Pharaoh took me." Citre's breath hitched, her chest tightening as she met the maiden's eyes. "What's your name?" The maiden's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Amira," she said, "and you must forget Merek. You must forget who you were. Because once the Pharaoh has you, you never get yourself back." Citre's throat tightened, her vision blurring as the maiden stood, her hands trembling as she set the bowl aside. "Rest now," Amira said, her voice flat, her eyes hollow. "And pray the Pharaoh tires of you quickly, because once you are pregnant, he will not need you anymore." The door closed with a heavy final thud, and Sitre sank back onto the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her hands resting on her belly. She was nothing now, nothing but a womb for a man who was more monster than king. And as the candle flickered and the shadows crept closer, Sitre closed her eyes, her fists clenched, her heart pounding as she whispered Merek's name one last time, a prayer that would never be answered. Citre's hands shook as she poured water over the basin, her eyes fixed on her reflection. The bruises on her wrists had darkened, spreading like ink beneath her skin. Her lip was still swollen, a crust of dried blood at the corner of her mouth. But it was her eyes that frightened her the most, hollow, lifeless, as if the soul inside her had already died. The door creaked open, and Amira stepped in, her eyes darting around the small, windowless room. "Eat," she said, setting down a wooden tray with a hunk of stale bread and a cup of watered-down wine. Sitre stared at the food, her stomach twisting. "I'm not hungry." "You must eat," Amira said, her jaw tight, her eyes hard. "The Pharaoh commands it. He wants you strong enough to bear his heir." Citre's fists clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. "And what if I refuse?" Amira's jaw tightened, her hands fisting in her robes. "Then they will force-feed you," she said, her voice low, her eyes dark. "And they will not be gentle." Sitre swallowed, her throat thick, her chest tight. "Has he done this to others?" Amira's eyes dropped to the floor, her shoulders stiffening. "He has done worse," she said, her voice hollow. "Much worse." Citre's pulse quickened, her heart pounding as she leaned closer. How many women has he taken?" Amira's gaze flicked to the door, her eyes haunted. "Too many," she whispered. "Most do not survive long enough to give him a child." Citre's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Did he—" Amira's jaw clenched, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "No," she said, her voice hard. "I was promised to the high priest. He did not want me carrying another man's child." Citre's breath hitched, her mind spinning. "The high priest. Does he know what the Pharaoh is doing?" Amira nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "He knows, and he does nothing." Citre's heart sank, her hands shaking as she reached for the bread, forcing herself to take a bite. The dry, tasteless crumbs stuck in her throat, and she swallowed, wincing as they scraped down. "You must endure," Amira said, her voice softening. "You must survive, for the child." Citre's jaw clenched, her fists tightening in her lap. "I never wanted his child," she said, her voice breaking. "I was promised to Merek." Amira's eyes darkened, her expression hardening. "Merek is dead," she said, her words like a slap to the face. "You are the Pharaoh's now." Citre's heart stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "What?" Amira's gaze dropped to the floor, her fists clenched. "The guards found him trying to climb the palace walls last night," she said, her voice tight. "They beat him to death and dumped his body in the river." Citre's world spun, her vision blurring as the room tilted beneath her. "No," she whispered, her chest heaving, her hands flying to her mouth. "No, he can't be. He is," Amira said, her eyes flashing, her jaw clenched. "And if you keep defying the Pharaoh, you will end up just like him." Citre's nails bit into her palms, her tears burning hot as they streamed down her cheeks. "I hate him," she hissed, her voice trembling, her body shaking. "I hate him." Amira leaned closer, her eyes fierce, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Then survive," she said, her breath hot against Citre's ear. "Survive and make him pay." Citre's chest heaved, her heart pounding as Amira rose to her feet, her robe swirling around her as she moved to the door. "Eat," Amira said, her voice cold, her eyes hard. "You will need your strength, because the Pharaoh is coming for you tonight." The door slammed shut, and Sitre was alone, her hands fisting in the sheets, her body trembling, her mind a whirlwind of rage, grief, and a single burning thought. If Merek was dead, then she had nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing left to lose was more dangerous than any king. The heavy wooden door swung open, and the Pharaoh stepped inside, his robes trailing behind him like a serpent's tail. Citre's breath hitched, her pulse pounding as she pressed herself against the wall, her fists clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms. The Pharaoh's eyes roamed over her, dark and hungry, his lips curling into a slow, cruel smile. "Are you ready to fulfill your duty, Sitre?" he asked, his voice low and cold, the sound slithering through the air like a blade. Citre's jaw clenched, her chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow breaths. "You killed him," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. "You killed Merek." The Pharaoh's smile widened, and he stepped closer, his fingers brushing against her cheek, tracing the bruise beneath her eye. "I did what had to be done," he said, his tone dripping with indifference. "A slave who defies the king must pay the price." Citre's heart hammered against her ribs, her blood roaring in her ears. "You're a monster!" The Pharaoh's hands shot out, fingers wrapping around her throat, his grip tightening just enough to make her gasp. "And you," he hissed, his eyes inches from hers, "are a vessel, nothing more." Citre's vision blurred, her nails scraping against his wrist as she struggled to breathe. "Let me go," she rasped, her voice a thin, broken whisper. The Pharaoh's eyes glinted and he leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "You will give me a son, Sitre," he whispered, his fingers tightening, his thumb pressing into her windpipe. "And you will do it with a smile." Citre's head swam, black spots dancing before her eyes, her knees weakening beneath her. But just as her world began to slip away, the Pharaoh released her, shoving her back against the wall. Sitre collapsed to the floor, her hands flying to her throat, her breath coming in ragged, heaving gasps. The Pharaoh watched her, his expression cold, his jaw set. "You will carry my child," he said, his voice flat. "And if you refuse, I will find another woman to replace you, and another, and another." Citre's nails dug into the stone floor, her body shaking, her tears streaming down her cheeks. "You will never have my child," she spat, her voice shaking, her eyes blazing. The Pharaoh's jaw twitched, his eyes narrowing. "You will give me what I want, Sitre," he said, his voice like a promise, dark and heavy. "Or you will die." And then he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him, the echo reverberating through the small, suffocating room like a death knell. Sitre slumped against the wall, her chest heaving, her skin slick with sweat, her hands shaking uncontrollably. He would come back. He would come back, and he would take what he wanted, and no one would stop him. Not the priests, not the guards, not the gods. Citre's jaw clenched, her teeth gritting, her fists tightening. Merek was dead. The Pharaoh was a monster, and she was nothing but a vessel. But as her fingers wrapped around the shard of pottery she'd hidden beneath the straw mat, her pulse steadied, her breathing slowed, her eyes darkened. He would come back, and when he did, she would be ready. Sitre paced the length of the small room, her fingers twisting the shard of pottery in her hand, the jagged edge biting into her skin. The night air was thick, heavy, pressing down on her like a shroud. Every creak, every distant footstep made her flinch, her pulse racing as she waited for the door to swing open, for the Pharaoh to return. Amira slipped inside, her eyes darting around the room, her expression grim. "He's coming," she said, her voice tight, her jaw clenched. "He sent the guards to prepare the chamber." Citre's breath hitched, her fists tightening around the shard until blood seeped between her fingers. I can't let him touch me again," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wild. "I won't." Amira stepped closer, her eyes dark, fierce. "Then don't," she said, her voice low, urgent. "Fight!" Sitre swallowed, her chest heaving. "With what? A broken shard? He's the Pharaoh, Amira. He has guards, power. The gods themselves bow to him." Amira's jaw clenched, her eyes flashing. "The gods may bow, but they don't bleed," she said, grabbing Citre's wrist, pulling her closer. "You do, I do, we all do. He is a man, Sitre, and men can be cut." Citre's throat tightened, her vision blurring with tears. "And if he kills me?" Amira's fingers dug into her arm, her voice a fierce, urgent whisper. "Then you die fighting. Better to die with blood on your hands than to live as his slave." Sitre swallowed, her jaw trembling, her nails digging into her palms. "What about you?" Amira's eyes darkened, her jaw tightening. "If he finds out I helped you, I'm as good as dead anyway," she said, her voice breaking. "But if you survive, if you can get away—" Citre's eyes searched Amira's face, her heart pounding. "Get away? How?" "The priests," Amira said, her voice lowering. "They're hosting a ceremony tonight, a tribute to the goddess Hathor. The temple will be packed. You can slip through the crowd, disappear before he realizes you're gone." Citre's pulse quickened, her chest heaving. "And you?" Amira's expression hardened, her jaw set. "I will distract him. Buy you time." Citre's breath hitched, her hands shaking. "He'll kill you." Amira's eyes glittered with unshed tears, her lips curving into a bitter, defiant smile. "Better that than to watch him do it to you." Citre's vision blurred, her throat tightening. "I can't leave you." "You can," Amira said, her voice fierce, her hands gripping Citre's shoulders. "You will. You are the only one who can." Footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy and deliberate, drawing closer with each step. Citre's heart pounded, her breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Amira grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. "Remember," she said, her eyes blazing. "Blood on your hands is better than his seed in your womb." The door swung open, and the Pharaoh stood in the doorway, his eyes dark, his smile cold. "Ready for me, Sitre?" he asked, his voice a low, cruel drawl. Citre's nails bit into her palms, the shard of pottery digging into her skin. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, her eyes fierce. "I'm ready." And as he stepped into the room, Amira slipped behind him, her eyes meeting Citre's, her lips forming a single, urgent word. "Run." And in that moment, Citre's legs sprang to life, her feet pounding against the stone floor as she bolted through the open door, the sound of the Pharaoh's roar echoing through the corridor like the wail of a dying god. Citre's feet slapped against the stone floor as she sprinted through the darkened corridors, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Shouts echoed behind her, the Pharaoh's roar reverberating through the palace like a thunderclap. "Find her! Bring her to me! Alive!" Citre's heart pounded as she darted around the corner, her fingers gripping the shard of pottery so tight it bit into her skin. Blood dripped from her palm, leaving a trail of crimson droplets in her wake. The temple courtyard loomed ahead, the sound of chanting priests and drums growing louder, the air thick with the scent of burning incense. The celebration for Hathor had begun, and the courtyard was packed with worshippers. Men and women swaying to the rhythm of the drums, their faces masked, their bodies draped in silks and jewels. Sitre's eyes darted around, searching for a place to hide. The guards would be here any second. "Sitre!" The voice cut through the chaos, and Sitre's gaze snapped to the left. Amira stood at the edge of the courtyard. Her hood pulled low, her eyes wide, urgent. "This way!" Sitre's legs burned as she sprinted toward her, weaving through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. Amira grabbed her arm, yanking her behind a stone pillar, her eyes wild. "Are you hurt?" "No," Sitre said, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. "But he knows I ran." Amira's jaw clenched, her eyes darkening. "Then we don't have much time." "Where do I go?" Sitre asked, her chest heaving. "The temple gates are sealed. The guards are everywhere." Amira glanced over her shoulder, her gaze darting to the crowd of priests and dancers. "You must blend in," she said, her hands reaching up to tear the veil from her own head, draping it over Sitre's hair. "Take this, keep your head down, move with them, act like you belong." Sitre swallowed, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the veil, her mind spinning. "What about you?" Amira's lips pressed into a thin line. "I will draw them away," she said, her jaw set, her eyes fierce. "They will think you ran toward the royal gardens. I will make them believe it." Sitre's chest tightened, her hands shooting out to grab Amira's wrist. "You can't! He will kill you!" Amira's eyes shone with unshed tears, her lips curving into a bitter, defiant smile. "I was dead the moment I helped you," she said, her voice breaking. "But you can still get out. You can still live." "Amira!" "Go!" Amira hissed, her jaw clenched, her eyes flashing. "Before it's too late." Sitre's breath hitched, her eyes locking onto Amira's, 1,000 unspoken words hanging between them. And then she ran, melting into the crowd, her head down, her hands shaking beneath the veil. Around her, the worshippers danced and chanted, their voices rising to the heavens as the priests lifted their arms to the sky, calling down blessings from Hathor. Sitre moved with them, her steps slow, measured, her eyes fixed on the temple gates ahead. The guards were stationed at every entrance, their eyes scanning the crowd, their spears gleaming in the torchlight. "Where is she?" one guard snarled, his gaze sweeping over the dancers. "The Pharaoh wants her alive." Sitre swallowed, her heart thundering as she edged closer to the gate, her pulse a wild, frantic drumbeat. Just a few more steps, just a few more breaths, and then a scream split the air, sharp, high, and filled with terror. Sitre's head snapped around, her heart dropping as she saw them. 2 guards dragging Amira across the courtyard, her hair wild, her robe torn, her eyes wide with fear. "I didn't do anything!" Amira screamed, her arms flailing, her heels digging into the ground as the guards hauled her toward the palace. I swear! Sitre's blood ran cold, her chest tightening, her feet frozen to the ground. "Amira!" "We know you helped her escape," one of the guards snarled, jerking Amira's head back by her hair. "Where is she? Where is the Pharaoh's concubine?" Amira's eyes darted through the crowd, her gaze locking onto Sitre's for the briefest, most devastating of moments. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking. "I never saw her." Sitre's nails bit into her palms, her chest heaving as Amira's screams echoed through the courtyard, the sound of flesh striking flesh ringing out like a death knell. "Where is she?" the guard bellowed, his fist slamming into Amira's jaw, the force of the blow sending her crumpling to the ground. Sitre's knees trembled, her breath catching in her throat, her body quaking with fury and fear. But then Amira lifted her head, blood dripping from her lip, her eyes shining with defiance as she glared up at the guard. "You'll never find her," she said, her voice a broken, trembling rasp. "She's already gone." Sitre's vision blurred, tears spilling down her cheeks as she turned away, her legs moving on their own, her feet pounding against the ground as she sprinted through the gate, the night air cool and sharp against her skin. Behind her, Amira's screams echoed, each one a dagger to Citre's heart, each one a reminder of the friend she had left behind to die. And as Sitre ran into the darkened streets, her breath coming in sobs, her heart shattering with every step, she knew one thing with terrifying certainty. Amira was already dead. And Sitre was next. Citre's feet pounded against the dirt path as she fled through the darkened alleys, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The veil slipped from her head, and her hair tumbled free, a cascade of black against her back. She couldn't think about Amira, couldn't think about the screams echoing in her ears, couldn't think about the blood that had stained the courtyard floor. All she could think about was running. Running as far away from the palace as her legs would take her. Ahead, the marketplace loomed, the stalls dark and empty, the scent of rotting fruit and stale bread hanging heavy in the air. Sitre darted between the stalls, her heart thundering, her eyes wild as she searched for a place to hide. The Pharaoh's guards would be searching the streets by now. It was only a matter of time before they found her. She stumbled into an alley, her shoulders slamming against the stone wall, her knees giving way as she sank to the ground. Blood smeared her palm, and she pressed it to her lips, stifling a sob. She couldn't cry. She couldn't make a sound. If they found her, it was over. A shadow moved at the end of the alley, and Citre's breath caught, her pulse roaring in her ears. A man stepped forward, his face half hidden by the hood of his cloak, his eyes dark, sharp, and glittering in the moonlight. Citre's heart hammered as she pressed herself against the wall, her fingers tightening around the shard of pottery in her hand. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't hurt me." The man's gaze dropped to her bloody hand, his jaw tightening. "Are you the one they're searching for?" Sitre swallowed, her throat dry, her eyes burning. "I don't know what you mean." The man stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel, his shadow stretching long and dark over her. "The Pharaoh's concubine," he said, his voice low, cold. "The one who ran." Citre's breath hitched, her fingers shaking around the shard. "Please," she said, her chest heaving, her pulse racing. "I can't go back. I can't." The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking over her torn dress, her bruised wrists, her blood-stained hands. For a long, terrible moment, he said nothing, his face an unreadable mask. Then he extended his hand, his eyes softening, his voice gentler now. "Come with me," he said. "I know a place where they won't find you." Citre's eyes darted to the alley's mouth, the sound of approaching footsteps echoing closer, louder. Her heart pounded, her skin slick with sweat, her mind spinning with fear and doubt. The man's hand remained outstretched, his expression calm, his eyes dark and steady. "Trust me," he said, his voice firm, urgent. "If you stay here, they will find you, and they will take you back to him." Citre's chest heaved, her throat tightening as she looked up at him, her vision blurring with tears. She didn't know him. She didn't trust him. But the footsteps were getting closer, the guards' voices growing louder, their shouts echoing through the marketplace like the roar of a coming storm, and she had no choice. Taking a shaky breath, Sitre placed her hand in his, her fingers trembling as his grip tightened around hers. "Good," he said, his voice a low, calming rasp. "Now run." And as they sprinted through the alley, the guards' shouts grew louder, the night closing in around them like a noose, and Citre's heart pounded with a single desperate thought. Amira was gone, the Pharaoh was coming, and this man was the only chance she had left. Citre's legs burned as she sprinted through the winding alleys, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The man's hand was a vice around hers, pulling her forward, forcing her to keep up. Behind them, the guards' shouts echoed through the streets, their torches casting flickering shadows against the stone walls. Citre's heart hammered, her pulse roaring in her ears as they twisted through a narrow passageway, the scent of rotting food and stale wine thick in the air. The man's grip tightened as they rounded a corner, and Sitre stumbled, her knees nearly giving out beneath her. "Keep moving," he said, his voice low, urgent, his eyes darting to the alley's mouth where the guard's shadows loomed closer. Sitre bit down on her lip, tasting blood, her fingers numb as she forced herself to run, her feet slapping against the ground, her chest heaving as she struggled to keep pace. The man led her down another alley, then another, the path winding like a snake through the slums. The shouts grew louder, the guards' footsteps pounding against the ground, their voices sharp, angry, ruthless. "She can't have gone far," one guard shouted. "Check every house, every stall." Citre's breath hitched, her vision blurring as the man yanked her into a darkened doorway, his back pressing against the wooden door, his hand clamping over her mouth. "Quiet," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. His eyes fixed on the alley as the guards' torches bobbed closer, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the walls. Citre's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they would hear it. The man's hand was warm against her mouth, his fingers rough, calloused, his grip firm but not cruel. Citre's eyes darted to the alley, her pulse quickening as the guards passed by, their faces twisted in frustration, their torches sputtering in the night air. "She's not here," one of them snarled, kicking over a crate, sending pottery shards scattering across the ground. "Keep looking!" The torches bobbed away, their shouts fading into the distance, the alley falling silent once more. The man released Sitre, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark as he stepped back, giving her space to breathe. Sitre sucked in a sharp breath, her knees shaking, her body sagging against the wall. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice a thin, trembling rasp. "Why did you help me?" The man's eyes glinted in the darkness, his jaw tight, his expression hard. "Because you don't deserve to die for what he did to you." Citre's throat tightened, her hands fisting in her tattered dress, her mind spinning. "You know what he did." The man's jaw worked, his fists clenching at his sides. "I know what he's done to many women," he said, his voice low, rough. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Sitre swallowed, her heart twisting, her chest aching with a pain so deep it felt like it would split her in two. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't ask for any of it." The man's eyes softened, the hard lines of his face easing as he stepped closer, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "No one asks to be caged," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "But that doesn't mean you have to stay there." Citre's breath hitched, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He'll never stop looking for me," she said, her voice shaking. "He'll kill anyone who helps me. He'll—" The man's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that slipped down her face. "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm, his eyes dark and steady. "I know a place where you can hide, where the Pharaoh's men can't find you." Citre's pulse quickened, her chest tightening as she searched his face, her mind reeling. "Why are you doing this?" The man's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath his cheek. "Because I lost someone once," he said, his voice rough, his eyes dark with pain. "Someone who didn't get away." Citre's throat tightened, her heart pounding as the man stepped back, his hand falling to his side, his gaze fixed on the alley's mouth. "We need to move," he said, his voice low, urgent. "There's a safe house on the outskirts of the city, but we have to leave now." Sitre swallowed, her eyes darting to the alley, the memory of Amira's screams still echoing in her ears, the image of her bruised, bloodied face seared into her mind. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice a whisper, her hand still trembling as she wiped the tear from her cheek. The man's eyes flicked to hers, his jaw tightening, his expression hardening once more. "Kafir," he said, his voice flat, his eyes dark as night. "And if you want to survive, you'll do exactly as I say." Citre's heart pounded, her breath coming in quick, sharp bursts as she nodded, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Okay," she said, her voice shaking. "Let's go." And as they slipped into the shadows, the night closing in around them like a shroud, Sitre's heart raced with a single desperate hope that the man named Kafir would keep his promise, and that somewhere in the darkness, she might finally find a place to breathe. Kafir led Sitre through a labyrinth of alleys and back streets, his grip firm around her wrist as they moved deeper into the slums. The stench of rotting food and animal waste filled the air, and the distant shouts of the Pharaoh's guards echoed through the night like a haunting refrain. Sitre's legs ached, her feet raw and blistered from running, but she kept moving, her heart pounding with a fear that clawed at her throat. Ahead, Kafir stopped abruptly, his eyes scanning the darkened doorway of a crumbling shack. "Inside," he said, his voice low, urgent. Sitre hesitated, her gaze darting around the alley, her pulse roaring in her ears. "What is this place?" Kafir's jaw clenched, his eyes dark and intense. "A place they won't look. Now get inside." Sitre swallowed, her throat tight, and stepped through the doorway. The air inside was thick, heavy, the room dimly lit by a single, flickering candle. The walls were bare, the floor littered with straw and scraps of old fabric. Sitre's chest heaved as she dropped to the ground, her knees giving way beneath her. Kafir moved to the window, pulling a tattered curtain across the opening, his eyes scanning the alley beyond. "You said you lost someone," Sitre said, her voice a thin, trembling whisper. "Who was it?" Kafir's shoulders tensed, his jaw working as he leaned against the wall, his gaze fixed on the window. "My sister," he said, his voice flat, hollow. "She was promised to the Pharaoh, taken to the palace. I tried to get her out, but—" He swallowed, his fists clenching at his sides. "I was too late." Sitre's heart twisted, her breath catching in her throat. "What happened to her?" Kafir's eyes darkened, a shadow passing over his face. "She died," he said, his voice tight, raw. "They said it was an accident, but I saw the bruises, the blood. The Pharaoh did it, and no one did a damn thing." Sitre's fingers curled into the straw beneath her, her nails digging into her palms. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her chest aching. "I know what it's like to lose someone." Kafir's gaze snapped to her, his eyes burning, his jaw clenched. "Who did you lose?" Sitre swallowed, her throat thick, her vision blurring. "Merek," she said, her voice breaking. "He was the man I was promised to. The Pharaoh had him killed." Kafir's fists tightened, his jaw flexing as he looked away, his eyes dark and stormy. "That's what he does," he said, his voice a low, simmering growl. "He takes what he wants and destroys what he can't keep." Sitre's chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Are you going to kill him?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Kafir's eyes met hers, his jaw set, his expression grim. "If I get the chance," he said, his voice hard, unyielding. "But first, we need to get you out of the city." Sitre's pulse quickened, her nails biting into her palms. "Where will we go?" Kafir pushed off the wall, moving to a small crate in the corner. He lifted the lid, revealing a pile of old, tattered robes. "Take these," he said, tossing them to her. "They'll hide your face. We're going to the docks. There's a ship leaving for Nubia at dawn. If we can get you on it, you'll be out of the Pharaoh's reach." Sitre's hands trembled as she clutched the robes to her chest, her eyes searching Kafir's face. "Are you coming with me?" Kafir's jaw clenched, his gaze hardening. "No," he said, his voice flat. "I have unfinished business here." Sitre's breath hitched, her chest tightening. "But if you stay, he'll kill you." Kafir's eyes darkened, his expression hardening into stone. "Better to die fighting than live as a coward," he said, his voice low, fierce. "My sister didn't get to run, but you can." Sitre's throat tightened, her heart pounding as she looked at the robes in her hands, the frayed edges, the thin, worn fabric. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For helping me?" Kafir's eyes flicked to the window, his jaw flexing as he listened to the distant shouts of the guards. the pounding of boots against the ground. "We're not safe yet," he said, moving to the door, his back to her. "Get changed. We leave in 5 minutes." Citre's pulse roared in her ears as she pulled the robes over her head, the fabric scratchy and rough against her skin. Outside, the shouts grew louder, the sound of swords clashing, voices yelling, the city coming alive with the Pharaoh's wrath. Kafir's hand closed around the hilt of a dagger at his waist, his jaw clenched, his eyes sharp as he opened the door a crack, peering into the alley. "Stay close," he said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "And no matter what happens, don't stop running." Sitre swallowed, her heart pounding, her hands shaking beneath the robes. "I won't." And as they slipped into the alley, the night closing in around them like a shroud, Citre's chest heaved with a single desperate hope that the ship to Nubia would be her salvation, and that the man named Kafir would live to see the Pharaoh's blood spill across the palace floor. Sitre moved through the darkened streets, her head bowed beneath the hood of the tattered robe Kafir had given her. The distant shouts of the Pharaoh's guards echoed through the alleys, their torches casting eerie, flickering shadows against the walls. Kafir walked ahead of her, his shoulders tense, his hand resting on the hilt of the dagger at his waist. The docks loomed ahead, the scent of salt water and fish thick in the air, the sound of creaking wood and murmuring sailors filling the night. Citre's heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears as she followed Kafir through the maze of crates and barrels, her eyes darting around, her breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. "There," Kafir said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on a small, weathered ship at the end of the dock. "That's the one. The captain owes me a favor. If we can get you on board, you'll be in Nubia by morning." Sitre swallowed, her throat dry, her fingers shaking as she clutched the edges of her robe. "And you?" Kafir's jaw clenched, his gaze hardening. "I stay." Citre's chest tightened, her eyes burning as she stared at him, her heart twisting. "He'll kill you." Kafir's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tense. "Maybe," he said, his voice rough, his eyes dark. "But I won't leave until I finish what I started." Citre's throat tightened, her mind spinning, her pulse pounding. "You can come with me," she said, her voice breaking. "We can go together." Kafir shook his head, his eyes flicking to the alley behind them, the sound of approaching footsteps sending a chill down Citre's spine. "Go," he said, his hand on her arm, his grip firm. "Get to the ship. Tell the Captain Kafir sent you. He'll know what to do." Sitre swallowed, her vision blurring as she looked up at him, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. Kafir's jaw clenched, his eyes dark, haunted. "Go," he said again, his voice tight. "Before it's too late." Sitre took a shaky breath, her heart hammering as she turned toward the ship, her feet heavy, her chest aching. The wooden planks creaked beneath her as she moved forward, her eyes fixed on the ship, her pulse roaring in her ears. "You there!" A guard's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, and Citre's blood ran cold. She froze, her fists clenched beneath her robe, her breath catching in her throat. The guard strode toward her, his eyes narrowed, his jaw set. "Show me your face." Citre's heart pounded, her knees weak, her mind spinning. If she pulled back the hood, it was over. The Pharaoh would find her. He would drag her back to the palace. He would finish what he started. The guard's hands shot out, grabbing her wrist, yanking her around to face him. "Now!" he barked, his eyes blazing. Citre's breath hitched, her mind screaming, her pulse roaring in her ears. And then, from the shadows, Kafir stepped forward, his dagger flashing in the moonlight. The guard's eyes widened, his mouth opening in a scream. But it was too late. Kafir's blade sank deep into his throat, the steel slicing through flesh and bone, the sound a sickening crunch. The guard's eyes went wide, his blood spraying across Citre's robe, his body collapsing to the ground with a heavy, final thud. Citre's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, her eyes fixed on the guard's lifeless body, her pulse thundering in her ears. Kafir grabbed her arm, his jaw clenched, his eyes fierce. "Run," he said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "Get on that ship and don't look back." Sitre's legs moved on their own, her feet pounding against the wooden planks as she ran toward the ship, the captain's shouts echoing through the night, the sailors scrambling to raise the sails. "Wait!" she cried, her hands grabbing the side of the ship, her nails digging into the wood. "Please!" The captain turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. "Who are you?" Sitre swallowed, her chest heaving, her vision blurring with tears. "Kafir sent me," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, I need to get to Nubia." The captain's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "Get aboard," he said, his voice hard, flat. "Now!" Sitre clambered up the side of the ship, her hands slipping on the ropes, her knees scraping against the wood. She hauled herself over the edge, collapsing onto the deck, her chest heaving, her body shaking. The ship rocked beneath her, the sails snapping in the wind, the water churning as they pulled away from the dock. Sitre crawled to the edge, her eyes scanning the pier, her heart pounding, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the shadows, Kafir stood, his dagger still dripping with blood, his eyes fixed on her, his expression dark, resolute. Sitre's chest ached, her hands fisting in the fabric of her robe, her tears blurring her vision. "Kafir!" she cried, her voice cracking. But he only shook his head, his jaw clenched, his eyes blazing. "Run," he mouthed, his voice lost to the wind, his figure fading into the darkness as the ship pulled away, the city growing smaller, the palace shrinking to a distant, haunting silhouette against the horizon. And as Sitre clung to the rail, her body shaking, her tears streaming down her face, she whispered his name into the night, a prayer, a curse, a promise she would never forget. Kafir, the man who saved her, the man who stayed behind to finish what he started, the man she would never see again.